I believe that We Who Wrestle with God by Jordan Peterson is possibly the most important religious book that has been written in my lifetime. Now, my assumption is that there's basically three reactions to me saying that. The first is the person who is automatically either against Jordan Peterson or against God, and in which case is like, you're an idiot, in which case I'm like, okay, well, why are you watching this video? Like, you can keep watching if you want, but I'm obviously not going to convince anything about you, so I'm kind of setting that reaction aside. The second reaction is someone who looks at this book and goes, wow, that's a really big looking book and it sounds complicated, and yeah, no thanks. In which case, kind of my only response is like, dude, grow a pair and read something that expands your mind, right? The third reaction is that there are people who would look at this or hear me say that, and they basically will disagree with it and be like, hey, I'm never going to read that book, either because I am convinced or someone has convinced me that it's not worth it because Jordan Peterson is not really a Christian. So I'm going to do two videos about this book. The first one is going to be kind of delving into that claim and delving into a little bit of backstory, kind of about how this book came about that I don't think a lot of people are really familiar with. And then the second video, I just want to dig in and I just want to talk about the book. So I'm going to have, that's going to be linked at the end of this. I'll put a link for it right here too. If you just want to see me kind of talk about some of the things in here, I basically took my favorite quote from every chapter or every section, and I'm just going to kind of delve into that. But for this video, I want to dig into this claim. I think this is possibly the most important religious book that's been written in my time. And I want to talk to the people who are immediately against it because of the idea either that they have or that someone else has given them that it's essentially useless because Jordan Peterson is not really a Christian. So the thing about Jordan Peterson is that he is one of these people who brings out the Dunning-Kruger effect in people almost more than like anyone I've ever met. So if you're unfamiliar with this, the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially when you think you know something, like you're very certain that you know something, but you very much don't know it. So your certainty is exactly proportionate to your level of incompetency. So the more certain you are, the more completely incompetent you are in having that opinion, but you have it very, very strongly. So it's just wild to me that there's all these people who I have met who have very firm opinions about Jordan Peterson and what he believes and what he thinks and whatever. And when you kind of dig into it, you're like, okay, so your whole opinion is based on you saw one AI generated video of him that wasn't even him. It was just his likeness. And it was him saying whatever the AI wanted him to say. Like I don't think you have a very valid opinion, right? So if we're going to look at that of like, okay, what makes a valid opinion, right? I have another video I'll link right here. I've read all of Jordan Peterson's books and I have engaged with hundreds of hours of his content. I really, really love the way the man thinks, and I've tried to learn from him a lot. And one of the things that I think a lot of people miss in his story, because he doesn't talk about it a whole lot, and it's in one of his books, which is probably his least popular book. And so I want to kind of walk through some of the stories, some of the highlights of the story point of how Jordan became who he is, right? So his first book was Maps of Meaning. This book came out in 1999. And in the kind of introduction to this book, he walks through kind of some of his story as a young person. And what he says in here is he talks about how he was, quote, raised under the protective auspices, so to speak, of the Christian church. So he wasn't in an overtly religious family, right? He's like, my father was pretty much an atheist. My mom would take me to church, but our whole family was run under the rule of Judeo-Christian morality, right? So even if we rejected Judeo-Christian spirituality for the most part, either directly like his dad or just kind of indirectly like his mom, because she didn't live it out, she just took him to church because that was the thing to do. They were very much under the direction of Judeo-Christian morality, right? So that's how he grew up. He was very much understanding the Judeo-Christian worldview, right? And then when he's 12, he goes and he talks to the priest and he asks him this kind of simple question of his, it goes, hey, how do you reconcile the biblical creation account with what it seems like science is showing us now? And the answer that he got was very unsatisfactory and was basically like, the worst kind of answer of like, well, creation is true because the Bible saith it is true and just don't think about it too much, And so in his 12-year-old mind, he talks about how the feeling that he got was, one, that's a crappy answer. And then two, he was like, I don't even feel like you believe that answer. And so he what he said was he decided that, quote, religion was for the ignorant, weak, and superstitious. So at 12, he decides like, boom, that's it, I'm done, screw it. Religion sucks. This is dumb. Not doing it, right? So then he goes on, and as a young teen, he joins up with the socialist movement, and he talks about how he just kind of embraced all of the ideas of socialism, all the tenets of Marxism, and it made sense to him how, economic disparity is the root cause of all the bad things in the world, and everything that happens bad is just because of an external force like causing me to act badly, right? The problem is all out there, right? And he talks about how he just completely embraced all of these maxims of the Marxist ideology and worldview. And then when he's 17, he starts engaging with some people who hold completely different political and social views as he does. And the thing that stood out to him was he goes, I'm looking at these people, and even though I completely disagree with their ideas in the political and social realm, when I look at them as people, I respect who they are. Like, I respect that man as a man. I respect that woman as a woman. And then what I'm noticing, though, is I look at the people who hold all the same views that I hold of the social and the political views, and he realized I don't respect any of them. Like, I don't like any of those people, and I don't want to be like any of those people. But they all agree with my like fundamental worldview ideas. But then I look at this group of people and they disagree with my fundamental worldview ideas, but I want to be more like them. I just think their ideas are bad. And so it starts to plant this seed of like, well, are their ideas that bad? And that opens up to one of the most transformative things that ever happened in his life, which was in college. One day he recognized like, wow, when I say things, there's this voice inside of my head that he called the critiquing voice, right? We would know it as your conscience, right? But he goes, when I say things, almost everything that I say, this voice critiques. So I say something and this voice goes, you don't actually believe that's true. Or you don't know that that's true. Or like, that's not really your idea. You're just parroting someone else's idea, right? And so he notices that when I say things, this voice critiques what I'm going to say. And so he decides to do this experiment of, can I say something that my internal critic doesn't criticize, right? And he starts kind of practicing and walking through this, and he learns that, there are certain things that I can say that this voice inside of me doesn't criticize as being wrong or false, or, like you don't really believe that or whatever. So in college, he makes this commitment to only speaking the things that voice didn't criticize. Later on, he would go to distinguish this as, I made a commitment to only speaking things that I knew to be true, right? So in college, he makes this fundamental shift of, I'm not going to say anything if I don't know it to be true, or I at least if I don't fully believe it to be true, right? Which is very different than just like, oh yeah, I think it's true, right? Because he's like, what I would say before is I would say stuff that I thought to be true, but I would still have this internal voice in my head going like, yeah, but you don't really believe that. Like, that's not really, like, I know you're saying that, but you don't really believe that. So he makes this commitment to only speak what is true, okay? And then in 1999, when he's writing the introduction to Maps of Meaning, his first book, one of the things that he says is, what I believe about the world now and how I act in consequence is so much at variance with what I believed when I was younger that I might as well be a completely different person. Okay? So he starts out younger, raised under Judeo-Christian values, decides, screw everything with the church. All this, I'm just going to join the complete socialist movement. I'm going to believe all this stuff, all the secular worldviews. They make all the most sense. And then 25, I don't remember how old he was at this point, but in 1999, he's looking back at that going, okay, but you know what? Like, what I believe now, as of this writing of this book, is so different than what I believed when I was younger that like, I may as well be a completely different person, right? So he makes this commitment to only speaking truth, and he changes radically to this point where he's unrecognizable to what he was earlier in his days, right? Now, the next point that I want to point out is that this was written in 1999. This was 25 years ago. We Who Wrestle with God came out in 2024. This book is 25 years from this book. And what I would say is that if you were to ask Jordan, hey, does the thing that you wrote in the preference of Maps of Meaning about being a completely different person from what you were as a young child, does that apply just as equally now to who you are writing We Who Wrestle with God as compared to who you were writing Maps of Meaning, right? And I would stake every bit of anything that I have on the fact that he would say, oh yeah, like who I am now and what I understand now and how I act in consequence of what I understand now is so different compared to who I was then when I was writing this first book that it's almost like I'm a completely different person. I would say that because fundamentally, if you look at these two books, Maps of Meaning is a book where Jordan did his best to explain the Bible by means of the world, right? So it is so dense. It's so dense. It's one of the only books I've almost quit. It was so dense, right? But fundamentally in this book, as it relates to anything biblical, he's essentially trying to use the world to explain the Bible, right? And then 25 years later, we get to We Who Wrestle with God. And in We Who Wrestle with God, fundamentally what he is doing is he is trying to explain the world by means of the Bible, right? The complete opposite. He went from trying to explain the Bible by means of the world to trying to explain the world by means of the Bible. Totally polar opposite things, right? So if we go back to what I said originally, which is that I think that this is possibly the most important religious book to be written in my lifetime. I want to clarify that claim a little bit, and then I want to explain why I think that is, right? So what I'm not saying is that I think this is the best religious book to be written in my lifetime, right? Best is not the same as most important, right? The most important doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. It just means it's the most important, right? I'm also not saying that this is the best or most important Christian book to be written in my lifetime, right? Because I said religious book, because it's not directly a Christian book. There are things in here that there's few things that just directly don't align with Christian theology, right? If you really want to get detailed about it. And then there's a bunch of other things that you're like, well, I mean, if you kind of explain a little bit more what you mean about that, you might kind of end up falling one way or the other of like, oh no, that's a very heretical idea, or like, oh, okay, no, I get what you're saying, right? But either way, this is not a exclusively Christian book. If you are reading this book to enhance your Christian theology, that's not a good idea. It's not what this book is for, right? This is a religious book, okay? But why I think this is so important is because Jordan Peterson represents what I think is going to be the norm of how people come to Christ in our generation, right? In our times of the last days, right? I'm not going to make any kind of last days argument. It's all been the last days since Jesus went to heaven. Okay. So in our, however long our phase of the last days lasts, I think Jordan Peterson represents how people are going to come to the Lord. And I would explain that by saying previously how Christians would preach the gospel and how unbelievers could engage with the gospel, right? Is we present the Christian worldview in answer to the three worldview questions, okay? So if you're unfamiliar with this, basically every worldview, no matter what it is, Christianity, Marxism, Buddhism, like any of these things, it has to answer three essential questions. It has to answer the question of creation, the question of the fall, and the question of redemption, right? So it has to provide an answer to creation, like where did we come from? Why are we here? Like what's the point of all of this? It has to answer the question of the fall. Why are there bad things? Why does evil exist, right? What causes evil? And then it has to answer the question of redemption, which is how do we fix it? Like where do we go from here? How do we undo the bad things that have caused all this stuff, right? So previously in my parents' generation and generations before that, the way that Christians could present the gospel was that the answers to the first two questions, even if an unbeliever didn't, completely agree with them or whatever, they were understood to be valid questions with valid answers, right? And the thing that has happened now is that our postmodernist, completely relativist society has gotten so twisted that people legitimately do not understand if something actually is broken, right? They don't actually really even believe that there is something as evil. So when you present the second worldview question of like, well, why is there evil in the world? some of these people like don't even have a concept of what evil is. It's like, well, it's like nothing's really good or evil. And it's not good or bad. Like nothing's really good or bad. It's all subjective. Whether I say it's good or bad, it's just my subjective opinion. Like there's no real thing that we can like point to that's like really evil, And while this mindset like is untenable and like you can't actually hold to it, right? Nobody does. It is a thing where it has become so ingrained in people that when we try to present the gospel as just the answer to the third worldview question, people do not have the requisite implicit understanding of the reality of the first two things to even be able to begin to comprehend the gospel answer to redemption of how do we fix it, right? And so I think the example of Jordan's life as how he went from completely rejecting religion to going and studying all this stuff and committing to only to only speaking the truth, that led him to this massive study of the evils of the 20th century. And what that did inside of him was it brought to light this understanding that evil is very, 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 very real. Like evil is undeniably real. There are things that are just purely evil, meaning that evil is a foundational piece of reality, right? And what that led him to is, okay, well, if evil is fundamentally something that exists in reality, then the opposite of evil has to also be something that exists in reality. Like if the path down to hell exists, then by definition, you can turn around on the path and go the other way, and that's taking you towards something that is not evil, right? So what his story represents is this idea that before anyone can even start to accept the gospel answer to the redemption question, they have to first have an implicit understanding of the truth that we obviously live in a moral universe, right? There is good and there is evil, right? And if you are still stuck in an ideology that says that there is like nothing is inherently good and nothing is inherently evil, you lack the prerequisite understanding to even begin to understand the gospel message. So the first reason why I think this is so important is because I think his life represents how people are going to come to the knowledge of the light of the gospel, and it's not how they have in previous generations. Because in previous generations, it was implicitly understood that there is good and there is evil, right? And that humans are fundamentally different than animals. Whether you believe, that we were created by God or whatever, like all of us knew, like, yeah, we're not the same. Like, even if I believe in evolution, like I believe that we're the pinnacle of evolution, and not like, we're just not the same as animals. So there was this implicit understanding that there's something different about humans and that the reality inherently has a good and evil aspect to it. And those things are just massively missing across such a huge swath of people in this day and age, right? They just don't understand that. So the way that he has journeyed along this path of relearning that obviously humans are different than everything else, all of the other creatures in the world. Like you just can't deny that we are completely different than everything else. And obviously good and evil exist. Those then leading to, okay, well, now you have the ability to even start to comprehend the gospel message to the redemption question of how do we fix it, right? So I believe that this is important because his story examples what I think is going to be the story for most people starting from this point kind of onward, right? I think this is going to become the norm of that is how people hear the gospel. They can't just hear the gospel message as the answer to redemption. They have to first reestablish an understanding that there is something different about humanity and that good and evil fundamentally do exist, right? And so the second reason for that is because Jordan Peterson is an incredibly impactful person, an author, speaker, thinker, right? So many people listen to him. And so even if people don't read this book, which, based on like Goodreads numbers, like this is not even close to his most popular book. Like almost nobody has read this book compared to his other ones, right? But even if they don't read it, if they continue to listen to him, they will still hear the message that he is preaching, which again, I believe is the message that most of them need to hear, which is that, dude, you cannot deny that there's something different about humanity. First question. And you cannot deny that there is fundamentally good and evil in this world, right? So people are going to hear these Christian answers to the first two worldview questions. As long as they listen to him, they're going to hear that whether they read this book or not. So he's going to continue to impact people in that way. And then the third reason, which I think is the biggest reason, is that it perfectly exemplifies that you cannot make a commitment to telling the truth and not eventually end up at the feet of Jesus. Right? If Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, you cannot make a commitment and do your best to hold to a commitment of always only speaking what you know to be true or what you believe to be true and not end up at Jesus. And that's what I think is so beautifully exemplified in Jordan's life. Like you look at this of just completely disavowing religion is for the stupidest, dumbest, worthless, most whatever thing ever, then makes this commitment, I'm only going to speak what I know to be true. And then 25 years later, longer than that, it was way more than 25 years at this point, but however many years later, now writing this book using the truth of the Bible to explain the world, and now working on the follow-up to this book that is examining all the stories from the New Testament and digging into Christ, right? And you look at, there was an interview that John Rich did with Jordan Peterson, talking about how Jordan was saying, like, I'm terrified to admit that Jesus is Lord and to give my life to Jesus Christ, because in all of this study and all this understanding, I have a incredibly visceral understanding that it will mean that I have to die to myself, and I don't know what he will make me. Like, I don't know what I will become after I give myself completely to him, because I understand the consequences of giving myself completely to him. And it's just the beautiful thing to me is I look at that and I don't have this reaction of like, see, he's not really a Christian. See, right? To me, that's this thing of like, oh my gosh, look at this dude. Like you cannot commit to speaking the truth and not end up at Jesus. If you keep speaking the truth, it only ever leads one place. It's the only place it can go. It always leads you to the truth, who is a person, not a thing, right? And so if you're going to commit to that, you will end up at Jesus, period, regardless, no matter how you do it. Now, what you do with Jesus when you get there, that's up to you. Like, that's not a guarantee of anything. But what is guaranteed is that the road to truth always ends up at the truth, period, no matter how you do it, right? So, yeah. I think that's all I've got for the beginning of this one. Like I say, I'm gonna split this up. I'm gonna make a 2-part video because I have a bunch of things that I really want to dig into here. Just kind of talking about some of the ideas that he presents in this book that really stuck with me or really stood out to me. So yeah, hopefully that helps. If you are one of the people, especially if you're one of the people, like I say, the Dunning-Kruger effect, man, it is for reals. It's for reals with Jordan Peterson. And there's so many people who think that they have this very solid understanding and opinion of him who it's just based on absolutely nothing at all. Like at all. They have not engaged with anything of his at all. So don't be that, please. At best, or, at worst, if you want to do it, just say that you just don't like him and you don't want to do anything with it, but don't pretend to have an opinion that can't be validated and is not built upon actually anything at all. That's just not good for anybody. So anyways, I'm going to link the second part of this right here. And if you want to get this book, there's links down in the description for this book, all the other books that I recommend. And yeah, that's all I got for this one. See you in the next one.